There are places in rural Pennsylvania where the forest still holds its secrets close, where the fog creeps through valleys like something with intention, where old stone churches stand as monuments to faith in landscapes that feel older than faith itself. St. Hildegard's Catholic Church was one of those places. Built in 1887 by German immigrants who'd carved a life from the Appalachian wilderness, the chapel sat at the end of Shepherd's Mill Road, a narrow gravel path that wound through stands of hemlock and white pine so dense that even midday sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor. The nearest town, Ridgway, lay 12 miles northeast. The nearest neighbor, nearly 3. It was the kind of place people found when they were looking for something, or when they were running from something else. Sister Catherine Brennan had arrived at St. Hildegard's in the autumn of 2017, one of 3 nuns from the Sisters of Mercy order who maintained the church and its small adjacent convent. She'd come from Philadelphia, from a life the other sisters whispered about but never discussed openly. A tragedy, they said, a loss that had driven her to seek solitude and service in equal measure. Those who knew her described a woman of quiet devotion, someone who found comfort in routine, in the predictable rhythms of prayer and daily mass, in the simple act of tending the church's small cemetery where generations of German and Irish Catholics rested beneath weathered headstones. She kept a journal. Every day, without fail, she wrote in a leather-bound book she'd carried with her from Philadelphia. Private thoughts, prayers, observations about the changing seasons, reflections on Scripture. She wrote in the early morning hours before Lord's, sitting in the small common room of the convent with a cup of tea, her handwriting neat and careful, each entry dated in the upper right corner. On November 18, 2020, Sister Catherine Brennan vanished. The circumstances were strange from the beginning. She'd conducted evening mass that Wednesday as usual, a small gathering of perhaps 15 parishioners, mostly elderly locals who made the drive through the hills for the comfort of tradition. Father Michael Kowalski, the visiting priest who said mass twice weekly, remembered her seeming perfectly normal that evening, focused, present. She'd assisted with communion, tidied the altar afterward, extinguished the candles with her usual methodical care. When the last parishioner departed around 7:15, she'd walked Father Kowalski to his car, standing in the amber glow of the church's exterior light, her black habit stirring slightly in the November wind. She asked me about the confessional, Father Kowalski would later tell investigators, his voice still carrying the weight of that memory. Said she'd heard something inside it earlier that day. A scratching sound, she said, like something moving behind the walls. He'd dismissed it. Old buildings made noises. Mice, probably. Squirrels in the walls. He'd promised to mention it to the church handyman, then driven away down Shepherd's Mill Road, his headlights cutting through the fog that had begun rolling in from the valleys. That was the last time anyone saw Sister Catherine Brennan. When she failed to appear for morning prayers at 5:30 a.m., the other 2 nuns, Sister Margaret and Sister Joan, initially assumed she'd fallen ill. But her bedroom door stood open, her bed made with military precision untouched. Her coat remained on its hook, her shoes lined up by the convent entrance, everything in its place except Sister Catherine herself, and her journal was gone. The Pennsylvania State Police arrived by mid-morning, led by Trooper Daniel Vasquez, a 15-year veteran who'd worked dozens of missing persons cases across the rural counties. He walked the property with the careful attention of someone who understood that details mattered, that the small things often told the biggest stories. The church sat in a clearing of perhaps 2 acres, the forest pressing close on 3 sides, the gravel road providing the only easy access. The convent building connected to the church through a covered walkway. Behind both structures, a small cemetery stretched toward the tree line, its oldest graves dating back to the 1890s. Vasquez noticed the doors first. The church's main entrance, a heavy oak double door with iron fixtures, stood unlocked. Sister Margaret insisted it had been locked when she'd checked it the night before, part of their evening routine. She had the keys. Sister Catherine had a duplicate set. But when Vasquez examined the lock, he found no signs of forced entry, no scratches or tool marks, nothing to suggest anyone had picked or broken it. The door had simply been opened, as if someone with a key had walked through. Inside, the church appeared undisturbed. Pews arranged in neat rows, prayer books stacked carefully, candles in their holders, the scent of incense still faintly present. The altar stood pristine, but Vasquez felt something off about the space, a quality he couldn't quite articulate. The air seemed heavier than it should, the silence more complete. His footsteps echoed too loudly against the stone floor. It was in the confessional that they found the first real anomaly. The confessional booth sat against the north wall, a traditional wooden structure divided into 3 compartments, the central priest's chamber flanked by 2 penitents' sides. The wood was old oak, dark with age and polish, carved with simple religious symbols. When Vasquez opened the priest's door, he immediately noticed the smell. Damp earth, something organic and wild, like the forest after heavy rain. And on the wooden seat, scattered across the dark cushion, were traces of mud. Not just mud. When the state police forensic team arrived later that afternoon, they'd identify the substance as a mixture of soil, decaying organic matter, and something else. A residue they couldn't immediately classify. The mud showed a pattern, as if something had sat or crouched in that space, pressing weight into the cushion. But the pattern didn't match any obvious form. Too large for a person sitting normally, too strange in its distribution, and there were marks on the walls. 4 parallel lines, each perhaps 18 inches long, carved into the wood paneling of the confessional's interior. Deep gouges, the wood splintered and raw, running at a slight downward angle. They looked like claw marks, but the spacing seemed wrong, too wide for any animal that should have been inside a building. A forensic technician photographed them extensively, taking measurements, collecting wood samples. The marks were fresh, the exposed wood still light in color, not yet darkened by age or dust. Could have been vandalism, one of the techs suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. The marks were inside the priest's chamber, a space rarely accessed by anyone except clergy, and they were positioned oddly, starting about 5 feet up the wall and dragging downward, as if whatever made them had been reaching from above. Trooper Vasquez expanded the search to the surrounding property. A team of officers combed through the cemetery, checked the convent building room by room, walked the perimeter of the clearing. In the soft earth near the forest edge, behind the cemetery's oldest section, they found tracks. Footprints definitely human, matching the size and tread pattern of the simple black shoes Sister Catherine wore. The prints led from the convent's back entrance, across the cemetery, and stopped at the tree line. Just stopped. The ground beyond showed no continuation, no obvious trail into the forest. The prints simply ended, as if she'd walked to that precise point and then ceased to exist, or been lifted. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Vasquez stood at the spot where the footprints terminated, looking into the dense hemlock forest, the fog still clinging to the understory, and felt something he rarely experienced, genuine unease. "We need search teams," he told his sergeant. "Dogs, volunteers, the whole protocol. She went into these woods, and we need to find out why." The search began that afternoon and continued for 9 days. Pennsylvania State Police brought in K-9 units, volunteers from Ridgeway and surrounding communities, even a helicopter with thermal imaging equipment. They covered hundreds of acres of forested terrain, following deer trails and logging roads, checking abandoned hunting camps and old mining sites that dotted the region. The bloodhounds picked up Sister Catherine's scent near the convent and tracked it to the same spot where her footprints ended, then lost it completely. The dogs circled, whined, refused to continue into the forest. Their handlers found this unusual but not unprecedented. Sometimes scent trails simply ended, disrupted by weather or water or countless other factors. But there was no water here, no stream or creek that might wash away a scent, just dense forest and the constant heavy fog. On the 3rd day of searching, a volunteer named Marcus Webb, a local hunting guide who knew these woods intimately, found something strange about a quarter-mile into the forest from where Sister Catherine's tracks had ended. A tree, a massive white oak, probably 200 years old, bore marks similar to those in the confessional. Deep parallel gouges in the bark, 4 of them, running vertically down the trunk. But these were higher, starting nearly 12 feet up the tree and descending 8 or 9 feet. The bark had been torn away in strips, exposing pale sapwood beneath. Black bear, maybe, Webb suggested to the state police officer accompanying him. They marked territory, claw trees, but I've never seen one reach that high, and the spacing's wrong. Bear claws are closer together. They documented the tree, took photographs and bark samples. Within the next 2 days, search teams found 3 more trees bearing similar marks, all within a half-mile radius of the church, all scored with those same parallel gouges, all impossibly high. One of the trees, an old hemlock, had several broken branches about 10 feet up, snapped cleanly, as if something large had moved through the canopy. The state police consulted with wildlife officials from the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Black bears were common in Elk County, certainly capable of climbing trees, but the pattern didn't fit bear behavior. The claw spacing measured roughly 7 inches between marks, significantly wider than a black bear's paw. Bobcats and mountain lions couldn't reach those heights. No known Pennsylvania wildlife matched the physical evidence. Could be equipment marks, one Game Commission officer offered, logging, tree maintenance, something mechanical. But there'd been no logging in this area for decades, and the marks were clearly fresh, the exposed wood showing no weathering. Sister Margaret and Sister Joan remained at the convent throughout the search, providing information to investigators, praying for Catherine's safe return. Sister Margaret, the eldest at 62, remembered something she initially hadn't thought significant. About 3 weeks before Catherine vanished, she'd mentioned feeling watched during her evening walks through the cemetery. Nothing specific, just a sense of presence, of eyes tracking her movement. Sister Margaret had attributed it to grief, to Catherine's tendency toward melancholy during the darker months. She said the forest felt different this year, Sister Margaret recalled, sitting in the convent's small kitchen while Vasquez took notes. Like it was closer somehow, pressing in. I told her it was just the fog, the season. We've been here 6 years and the forest is always the forest. But Catherine had persisted. She'd mentioned strange sounds at night, movement she glimpsed from her window that faced the woods. Once she'd sworn she saw something tall and dark moving between the headstones around midnight, but when she'd looked more carefully, nothing was there, just shadows and moonlight playing tricks. Did she seem frightened? Vasquez asked. Sister Margaret considered this carefully. Not frightened exactly, more curious. Catherine had a scientist's mind before she entered the order. She studied biology in college. She wanted to understand things, to find rational explanations. I think she believed there was some animal out there, something unusual, and she was more interested than afraid. They found Catherine's crucifix on the 7th day of searching. A teenage volunteer spotted it hanging from a low branch about 300 yards into the forest, the silver chain tangled in twigs and dead leaves. The cross itself, simple and small, showed no damage. It hung at eye level, approximately 5.5 feet off the ground, positioned almost as if it had been deliberately placed there. The chain's clasp remained closed, meaning it hadn't fallen or broken off. Someone, or something, had removed it. The forensic team processed the crucifix carefully, checking for fingerprints, DNA, any trace evidence. They found only Sister Catherine's skin cells and oils from regular wear. Nothing else. No explanation for how it had traveled from her neck to a tree branch deep in the forest. By the 9th day, with temperatures dropping and the first snow beginning to fall, the active search was suspended. Trooper Vasquez stood in the church parking lot as volunteers packed up equipment and headed home. The grey sky pressing down like a weight. They'd covered over 300 acres, checked every structure within a 5-mile radius, interviewed everyone with even a tangential connection to Sister Catherine or St. Hildegard's. They had footprints that ended, a crucifix in a tree, strange claw marks on wood and bark, traces of mud in a confessional, and no body, no witness, no logical explanation. She walked into those woods, Vasquez said to his sergeant. That much we know. But what happened after that? He trailed off, looking at the tree line where the forest waited, dense and silent and keeping its secrets. The case remained open, but went cold quickly. Missing persons cases in rural areas often did, especially when the missing person appeared to have entered wilderness voluntarily. The Pennsylvania State Police generated reports, logged evidence, maintained files. Sister Catherine's family, a younger brother in Pittsburgh, an elderly mother in a Philadelphia nursing home, kept calling for updates that never came. The Archdiocese of Erie held a memorial service in December, though they stopped short of declaring her deceased. The Sisters of Mercy Order reassigned Sister Margaret and Sister Joan to other parishes. St. Hildegard's remained open, served by visiting priests, but felt emptier, haunted by unanswered questions. 3 years passed. The case file gathered dust in a filing cabinet in the state police barracks in Ridgeway. Trooper Vasquez, now a sergeant himself, occasionally pulled it out late at night, reviewing the photographs of claw marks and footprints that ended, wondering what he'd missed. And then in March of 2023, construction workers renovating St. Hildegard's Confessional made a discovery that would reopen everything and provide answers that only deepened the mystery. The Archdiocese had finally approved funds to restore the church's aging interior, starting with the confessional booth. When the crew began removing sections of the old oak paneling to check for water damage and wood rot, they found a gap behind the priest's chamber wall, a space that shouldn't have existed, sealed off decades ago during previous renovations. The foreman, a man named Tony Castellano, shined his flashlight into the darkness and saw something wedged deep in the cavity. A book, leather-bound, covered in dust, marked with those same parallel gouges they'd found on the confessional walls 3 years earlier. Sister Catherine's journal. The question that stopped everyone cold was simple and impossible. How did a journal belonging to a woman who vanished from outside the building end up sealed inside a wall space that hadn't been accessed in over 30 years? Was it hidden there deliberately? Or did something else put it there for someone to find? Tony Castellano had worked construction for 32 years, mostly historic restorations across western Pennsylvania. He'd pulled down walls in buildings dating back to the Civil War, uncovered hidden rooms in Victorian mansions, found forgotten artifacts sealed behind plaster and wood. But he'd never felt the kind of cold unease that gripped him when his flashlight beam landed on that leather-bound book wedged in the wall cavity of St. Hildegard's Confessional. The gap itself was architectural, a space created when the original 1887 structure had been modified in the 1960s, sealed with paneling that hadn't been disturbed since. Castellano could see the old nails, rusted and undisturbed, the wood aged and settled. No one had opened this space in decades. The dust lay thick as velvet, and when he carefully extracted the journal with gloved hands, the leather felt cold, far colder than the ambient temperature of the church. "Call the police," he told his crew. "Don't touch anything else." Sergeant Daniel Vasquez received the call at 2:47 p.m. on March 15, 2023. He was at his desk in the Ridgeway barracks, reviewing incident reports, when his phone rang and a voice he didn't immediately recognize said, "We found something at St. Hildegard's, something that belonged to Sister Catherine." Vasquez felt his pulse quicken. He'd thought about this case more times than he cared to admit over the past 3 years, the unanswered questions gnawing at him during quiet moments. He grabbed his jacket and was on Shepherd's Mill Road within 20 minutes, his vehicle climbing through the forested hills. The late winter landscape still grey and dormant, patches of old snow clinging to the shadowed hollows. The church looked exactly as he remembered it, stone walls dark with age, the peaked roof, the small cemetery behind, the forest pressing close. Castellano met him at the entrance, his expression tight with something between confusion and concern. "It's in the confessional," Castellano said. "Behind the wall where we found those claw marks back when she disappeared. I didn't open it. Figured that was your job." Vasquez followed him inside, and the memories came flooding back. The smell of old incense and wood polish. The heavy silence. The confessional booth against the north wall, exactly where it had always been. The state police forensic team had examined it thoroughly 3 years ago, documented the scratches, collected samples. But they'd never thought to look inside the walls. The journal lay on a white cloth Castellano had placed on a nearby pew, careful not to contaminate potential evidence. Vasquez recognized it immediately from Sister Margaret's description. Dark brown leather, about 8 by 10 inches, the edges worn from regular handling. The cover bore deep parallel gouges, 4 of them, the leather torn and the cardboard backing beneath visible. The same marks that had appeared on the confessional walls, on the trees in the forest. He photographed it extensively before touching it, documenting its condition and position. Then, using latex gloves, he carefully opened the cover. Sister Catherine's name appeared on the inside front page, written in elegant cursive. Below it, a date, January 1st, 2020. The journal had been intended to last the full year, and it nearly had. The entries ran chronologically, dated and consistent. her handwriting neat and controlled. Vasquez turned pages slowly, scanning the contents. Morning prayers, reflections on scripture, observations about the changing seasons, the parishioners, small moments of daily life at St. Hildegard's. Then he found the entries from October and November 2020, and his skin prickled with recognition. October 3rd, 2020. The forest is different this autumn. I can't explain it precisely, but something has shifted. When I walk through the cemetery in early morning, I feel a presence I haven't felt before. Not malevolent exactly, but aware, watching. The rational part of my mind says it's deer or other wildlife, perhaps drawn closer by the acorn crop, but there's a weight to this attention that feels intentional. I find myself looking over my shoulder, searching the tree line for movement that's never quite there when I turn. October 17th, 2020. Sister Margaret thinks I'm imagining things, and perhaps I am. But last night I heard something outside my window. Not the usual forest sounds, raccoons, owls, the wind. This was different. A low sound, almost a rumble, but with a quality that seemed impossibly deep, like it came from something very large. I looked out, but saw only darkness and the vague shapes of headstones in the moonlight. When I checked this morning, there were impressions in the soft ground beneath my window. Not hoofprints or paw prints, just depressions, as if something heavy had stood there. The grass was crushed flat in a pattern I couldn't identify. October 29th, 2020. I've been researching the history of this land. The church records go back to 1887, but before that, this area was wilderness. The German settlers who built St. Hildegard's wrote about the forest in their letters and diaries, some of which are preserved in the Archdiocese archives. They mentioned things in the woods, creatures. Several families reported livestock disappearing, strange calls in the night, trees stripped of bark at impossible heights. They attributed it to bears or wolves, though wolves were already rare here by the 1880s. One letter from 1889, written by a farmer named Johann Weber, described finding his cow dead in a clearing, marked by claws too large for any beast known to Christian men. I find myself wondering what they really saw, what they were too afraid to name. Vasquez read these entries with growing attention, his investigator's mind automatically categorizing the information. Sister Catherine had been experiencing, or at least perceiving, something unusual in the weeks before her disappearance. The entries showed a methodical mind trying to make sense of anomalous experiences. She wasn't hysterical or delusional. She was observing, documenting, attempting to understand. November 5th, 2020. I saw it tonight. Or I think I did. I was locking the church after evening mass, and movement caught my eye near the cemetery's far edge. Something tall, much taller than a man. It stood just inside the tree line, barely visible in the darkness, but I could make out a shape. Upright, still, watching. I froze, my hand on the church door, my heart hammering. We stared at each other. If it had eyes, I couldn't see them, but I felt the weight of its attention for perhaps 10 seconds. Then it stepped backward into the forest and was gone. When I checked the spot this morning with Father Kowalski, we found nothing. Just undisturbed leaves and shadows. November 10th, 2020. It's been in the church. I'm certain now. The smell is unmistakable. Earth and decay, wild and ancient. I found traces of mud in the confessional yesterday, on the priest's seat where no one has sat in days. And there are scratches on the inside walls, fresh gouges in the wood. I showed them to Father Kowalski, but he dismissed them as settling, age, mice. But mice don't leave marks 4 inches deep. Something has been inside this sacred space, and I don't understand why. What could it want here? What draws it to this place of prayer and sanctuary? November 15th, 2020. I've made a decision. I'm going to try to communicate with it. I know how that sounds, like madness or spiritual pride. But if there's something in these woods, something intelligent enough to watch and wait, then perhaps it can be understood. I've been leaving offerings at the forest edge, simple things, food and water, and they're always gone by morning. Tonight after Mass, if it appears again, I'm going to approach it. Not out of recklessness, but out of faith. If God created all things, then even this creature, strange as it may be, is part of His creation. I'm not afraid. Or rather, I'm choosing not to be. That was the last entry before the one dated November 18th, 2020. the day she vanished. Vasquez turned the page with careful fingers, and his breath caught. November 18th, 2020. It's waiting for me. I can feel it, patient and certain, just beyond the light's reach. After Mass tonight, after Father Kowalski leaves, I'm going to meet it. I need to understand what it is, why it's here, what connection it might have to this place. I'm leaving this journal in the confessional for safekeeping. If anything happens, if I don't return, I want there to be a record. I don't believe it means me harm, but I'm not naive enough to assume I'm safe. Whatever happens next, I go willingly in faith and curiosity. If I learn something remarkable, I'll return with knowledge. If I don't return, then at least someone will know I wasn't taken. I chose to go. There's a sound it makes, a low frequency I feel in my chest more than here. It called to me 3 nights ago, and I understood somehow that it wanted me to come, to follow. I think it's been trying to show me something, lead me somewhere. The rational part of my mind says this is delusion, that I'm projecting meaning onto animal behavior. But the part of me that chose this life of faith, that believes in mysteries beyond understanding, that part knows this is real. This is happening. If you're reading this, know that I wasn't afraid at the end. I was curious, and maybe that's its own kind of courage. The entry ended there. The remaining pages of the journal were blank. Vasquez sat in the pew, the journal open before him, and felt the weight of revelation and deepened mystery simultaneously. Sister Catherine had documented her own disappearance. She'd known something was coming for her, or that she was going to it, and she'd left a record. But the most troubling detail was the journal's location. She'd written that she was leaving it in the confessional for safekeeping. The logical assumption was she'd placed it on the seat or hidden it somewhere obvious. But it had been found sealed inside a wall space that hadn't been opened in decades. How? He called in a full forensic team, and by evening, St. Hildegard's was once again surrounded by state police vehicles, technicians, investigators. They photographed the wall cavity extensively, examined the removed paneling, tested the journal for fingerprints and DNA. The results would take weeks, but the preliminary findings were immediately puzzling. The journal showed Sister Catherine's fingerprints throughout, as expected. But the leather cover also bore traces of an organic substance, not human. The lab would need time to identify it, but initial analysis suggested animal proteins, possibly from skin or fur. But the cellular structure didn't match any known Pennsylvania wildlife in their database. The dust inside the wall cavity dated appropriately for a space sealed in the 1960s. The nails showed no signs of recent removal or replacement. By every measurable standard, that wall space hadn't been accessed in over 30 years. Yet the journal had been inside it, placed there sometime after November 18th, 2020. Could she have put it there before the renovations in the 60s? One technician suggested, but the math didn't work. Sister Catherine had been born in 1986. The journal was dated 2020. There was no rational explanation that fit the physical evidence. Vasquez authorized a renewed search of the surrounding forest, though he held little hope of finding more than they had 3 years ago. A team of officers and volunteers spread out from the church, covering the same ground they'd covered before, looking for anything they might have missed. The forest remained largely unchanged, hemlock and oak, dense understory, the fog that seemed perpetual in this valley. On the second day of the renewed search, a state police officer named Amy Reeves found something near one of the trees marked with claw scratches 3 years earlier. Half buried in forest duff, camouflaged by leaves and moss, lay a small object that caught a glint of sunlight. She carefully brushed away the debris and revealed a silver button, the kind used on women's religious habits. She recognized it immediately. She'd seen identical buttons on Sister Catherine's clothing in the missing person file photographs. The button showed damage consistent with being torn away forcefully. The metal was bent, the threads that had attached it to fabric ripped away. Reeves marked the location, called it in, and watched as forensic techs processed the scene. They found the button 20 feet from the base of the marked tree, positioned as if it had fallen or been dropped from above. From the canopy, the team looked up at the towering hemlock, its branches starting 15 feet up the massive trunk. Nothing suggested Sister Catherine had climbed it, nothing suggested anyone had. But the button had come from somewhere, and its position implied a height before falling. Could a bird have carried it? Reeves asked. But even as she said it, she knew how inadequate that explanation sounded. What bird would tear a button from clothing and carry it hundreds of yards into the forest to drop it precisely beneath a tree marked with unexplained claw scratches? Vasquez interviewed people again, revisiting witnesses from 3 years ago, searching for details that might take on new meaning in light of the journal's revelations. Father Kowalski, now 73 and semi-retired, remembered the conversation Sister Catherine had mentioned in her November 10th entry about the scratches in the confessional. She was very serious about it, Father Kowalski recalled, sitting in his small apartment in Ridgeway, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug. Not frightened, but intent. She wanted me to see them as significant, but I didn't. I thought they were just damage, wear, something mundane. I dismissed her concerns because they seemed irrational, but she was a rational person, Sergeant, one of the most level-headed women I'd ever met. If she said something was wrong, I should have listened. Did she ever mention trying to communicate with whatever she thought was out there? Vasquez asked. Father Kowalski's eyes widened slightly. No, never. If she'd told me that, I would have insisted she speak with someone. That kind of thinking, that's... He trailed off, struggling for words. It's not safe, spiritually or physically. But Sister Catherine had never mentioned it, had kept her intentions private, recorded only in her journal. Vasquez wondered if she'd known how people would react, if she'd deliberately concealed her plans because she understood they'd try to stop her. The forensic analysis of the journal's organic traces came back 3 weeks later, and the results added another layer of impossibility to the case. The substance on the leather cover contained proteins that were indeed animal in origin, but the specific composition didn't match any species in the FBI's wildlife database. The cellular structure suggested something mammalian, but the DNA sequencing returned incomplete results, fragments that couldn't be properly identified or classified. It's degraded, the lab technician explained over the phone, or possibly contaminated. We are getting sequences that partially match several different species, black bear, elk, even some canine markers, but nothing complete, nothing definitive. It's like... He paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. It's like we're looking at something that shares genetic material with multiple animals, but isn't exactly any of them. That's not possible, Vasquez said flatly. I know. That's why I'm saying the sample must be contaminated. But I've never seen contamination produce this specific pattern. Usually contamination is obvious. You get clear signatures from multiple distinct sources. This is different. This looks almost blended. Vasquez added that information to his growing file of unexplainable data. The case was officially reopened, classified as an active investigation, though he had no illusions about where it was heading. They had more questions now than 3 years ago, and the answers seemed to recede further the more they learned. The local media picked up the story. Missing nun's journal found in church wall, and suddenly St. Hildegard's was news again. Reporters arrived, filming the old stone church, interviewing anyone willing to talk. The story spread to regional news, then briefly national, the mystery of the sealed wall and the journal's final entry capturing public imagination. Psychics called the state police claiming to have visions. Conspiracy theorists posted online about government experiments and cryptids. Paranormal investigators requested access to the church for their cable television shows. Vasquez ignored all of it, focusing on the evidence, the physical facts. Sister Catherine had documented feeling watched, had observed something she couldn't identify, had left a record of her intention to make contact with whatever presence she'd perceived. Then she'd walked into the forest and vanished. Her journal had somehow ended up sealed inside a wall space it shouldn't have been able to access. Her crucifix had been found hanging from a tree branch. A button from her habit lay beneath a tree, marked with impossible claw scratches. And in all of this there was one detail that kept returning to haunt him. The footprints. Her footprints leading to the forest edge and simply stopping, as if she'd been lifted. Combined with the button found 20 feet from a tree's base, with the claw marks starting 12 feet up the trunks, with the broken branches in the canopy. What if she had been lifted? What if something had carried her up, into the trees, into the dense forest canopy where the search teams had never thought to look? We need to search again, Vasquez told his captain, but this time we look up. Could something that large really move through the trees without being seen? Or was there another explanation we're still missing? The concept of searching a forest canopy sounds straightforward until you actually attempt it. Trees in the Allegheny region of Pennsylvania grow dense and tall, their upper branches forming an interconnected network 50 to 80 feet above the ground. Visibility from below is limited by layers of foliage in summer, slightly better in winter, but even then, the tangle of branches, the play of light and shadow, the sheer scale of the three-dimensional space makes systematic searching nearly impossible with conventional methods. Sergeant Vasquez contacted the Pennsylvania Bureau of Forestry and explained what he needed: a canopy-level examination of the forest surrounding St. Hildegard's Church, focusing on the area where Sister Catherine's footprints had ended, and radiating outward from the trees bearing claw marks. The Bureau connected him with Dr. Elena Ruiz, a forest ecologist from Penn State, who specialized in canopy research and had access to climbing equipment and trained personnel. Dr. Ruiz arrived at St. Hildegard's on a cold morning in early April 2023, accompanied by 2 graduate students and enough climbing gear to scale a dozen trees. She was in her mid-40s, compact and athletic, with the practical demeanor of someone who spent more time in forests than offices. Vasquez walked her through the case details, showed her the photographs of the claw marks, the locations where evidence had been found. "You're looking for signs of movement through the canopy," Dr. Ruiz summarized, studying the trees. "Something large enough to carry a human body over a sustained distance." "I know how it sounds," Vasquez said. "Actually, it's not as impossible as you might think," she replied, surprising him. "Theoretically, I mean. Several primate species move through canopies while carrying infants or food. Some large predators, leopards for instance, will drag prey into trees. The question isn't whether it's physically possible, but whether anything in Pennsylvania could do it." She paused, looking up at the hemlock canopy. "And based on known wildlife, the answer is no. Nothing here has the size, strength, or arboreal adaptation for that kind of movement. But you're willing to look? I'm willing to see what's actually up there. Physical evidence doesn't lie, even if it contradicts our assumptions." Over the next 3 days, Dr. Ruiz and her team climbed 15 trees in the search area, using rope systems and harnesses to access the upper canopy. They documented everything: branch structure, bark damage, the presence of nests or dens, any anomalies. And they found things that shouldn't have been there. The first discovery came 30 feet up a large white oak, about 200 yards from the church, caught in a fork where 2 major branches diverged. Partially concealed by old leaves and debris was a piece of black fabric. Dr. Ruiz carefully extracted it and lowered it to the ground in an evidence bag. The fabric measured approximately 6 inches by 4 inches, torn raggedly along the edges. Vasquez recognized it immediately: the heavy cotton polyester blend used in religious habits. The forensic team confirmed it matched Sister Catherine's clothing. The tear pattern suggested it had been ripped away forcefully, caught on wood, or possibly something else. But the fabric's location, 30 feet above the ground in a tree's upper structure, deepened the central mystery. How had it gotten there? The second discovery was more disturbing. On a massive hemlock roughly 300 yards into the forest, at a height of approximately 40 feet, Dr. Ruiz found an area where multiple branches had been broken or bent, creating a kind of platform. The breaks were old, dating back at least a few years based on the weathering and the healing patterns in the wood. Something heavy had moved through this space, disrupting the natural branch structure. Several of the broken branches showed the same parallel scoring they'd found on other trees, those distinctive 4-line marks, gouged deep. "This could be storm damage," Dr. Ruiz said, descending from the tree and removing her helmet. "High winds, falling debris from a taller tree. But the pattern is unusual. The breaks radiate from a central point, and there's a cleared space about 6 feet in diameter. It almost looks deliberate." "Like a nest?" one of her graduate students asked. "Or a resting place. But again, there's no animal in Pennsylvania that creates structures like this in canopy at this height." They documented the platform extensively, took samples of the broken wood, measured the dimensions. Below the hemlock, searching the ground, a state police officer found something that made everyone stop. Partially buried in the duff, small and easy to miss, was a rosary. The beads were wooden, simple and worn, the crucifix at the end tarnished silver. When they checked it against Sister Catherine's personal effects inventory, they found a match. It was the rosary she'd carried daily, kept in her habit's pocket. The rosary lay 40 feet below the platform in the hemlock's canopy. The mathematical precision of that alignment felt deliberate, as if the object had fallen directly from above or been dropped. Vasquez stood beneath the hemlock, looking up at the dense branches, trying to reconstruct events. Sister Catherine walks from the convent after evening mass. Something is waiting for her at the forest edge. She goes willingly, according to her journal. Then what? She's carried up into the trees, moves through the canopy somehow. The physical evidence suggested yes, but the biological reality suggested no. The gap between those two conclusions was where the mystery lived. Could a person climb these trees? He asked Dr. Ruiz. With proper equipment, training, and time, absolutely. Without equipment, possible but extremely difficult and dangerous. The lower branches on these older trees start 12 to 15 feet up. You'd need exceptional upper body strength to reach them, and moving between trees at canopy level requires experience and physical capability most people don't have. What if someone was highly motivated, fleeing from something, or following something? Dr. Ruiz considered this. Even motivated, Sister Catherine was a 34-year-old woman with no documented climbing experience. Getting 30 or 40 feet up one tree would be challenging enough. Moving between multiple trees, traveling hundreds of yards through the canopy, that goes beyond motivation into superhuman capability. But the evidence was there. Fabric caught 30 feet up, a rosary beneath a canopy platform, a button near another marked tree. All of it suggested vertical movement, a path through the trees rather than along the ground. The media attention intensified with these discoveries. Cable news stations picked up the story, framing it in increasingly sensational terms. Nun's mysterious canopy trail became a headline. Online communities debated theories ranging from the plausible, she'd been abducted by a person or persons unknown, who moved her body through the trees to confuse searchers, to the fantastical, she'd encountered Bigfoot, or aliens, or some other cryptozoological entity. Vasquez tried to ignore the noise and focus on investigation. He brought in additional experts. A forensic anthropologist reviewed all the physical evidence, looking for patterns. A behavioral psychologist analyzed Sister Catherine's journal entries for signs of mental illness or delusion. A wildlife biologist examined the claw marks and organic traces, searching for explanations within known animal behavior. The conclusions were uniformly inconclusive. The anthropologist confirmed the evidence suggested Sister Catherine had indeed traveled through or been transported through the canopy, but couldn't explain how. The psychologist found Sister Catherine's journal entries rational, observational, showing no signs of psychosis or delusional thinking. The wildlife biologist admitted the claw marks didn't match any Pennsylvania fauna, but suggested the possibility of an escaped exotic animal, perhaps a large primate or big cat, that had since died or moved on. But wouldn't an escaped animal have been reported? Vasquez asked. Wouldn't someone have noticed a tiger or gorilla missing from a zoo or private collection? You'd think so, the biologist admitted, but exotic animal ownership isn't always legal or documented. It's possible someone kept something illegally, it escaped, and they never reported it out of fear of prosecution. It was a theory, not a good one, but better than nothing. Vasquez added it to his file alongside all the other partial explanations that didn't quite fit. He returned to the journal, reading Sister Catherine's words over and over, searching for details he might have missed. Her entries painted a picture of someone experiencing something extraordinary, attempting to make sense of it through observation and reason. She described the creature, if that's what it was, as tall, upright, deliberate in its movements. She'd felt watched, but not immediately threatened. The interactions, such as they were, had progressed over weeks. A slow approach, almost like mutual curiosity. And then there were the historical references she'd researched. The German settlers' accounts from the 1880s, mentioning creatures in these woods, impossible claw marks, missing livestock. Vasquez decided to follow that thread. He contacted the Archdiocese of Eerie and requested access to their historical archives, specifically any documents related to St. Hildegard's founding and the early years of the German settlement. Sister Teresa, the elderly archivist, met him in the basement of the diocesan offices in Eerie, surrounded by filing cabinets and boxes of aged documents. She was in her 70s, thin and precise, with the patient expertise of someone who'd spent decades organizing the past. Sister Catherine requested access to these same materials about 6 months before she disappeared, Sister Teresa said, pulling out a cardboard box labeled St. Hildegard Parish, Founding Documents, 1887-1900. She spent several afternoons here, reading through letters and church records. She seemed particularly interested in the early settlers' accounts of the area. Vasquez opened the box carefully. Inside were letters, ledgers, photographs, all preserved in acid-free folders. Many were in German, the old Gothic script difficult to read, but some had been translated, and among these he found the letter Sister Catherine had mentioned in her journal, the one from Johann Weber dated 1889. The translation read, "We found the cow dead in the clearing on the morning of October 12th. The marks upon her were unlike any I have seen in 40 years of farming. Claws too large for wolf or bear, gouges in the flesh that suggested great strength. My son Franz said he heard calls in the night, sounds that made our dogs cower and whine. The forest here holds things that do not wish to be known. We keep our children close after dark and pray for protection." Another letter, this one from a priest named Father Heinrich Müller, who had served St. Hildegard's from 1887 to 1892, described strange occurrences. The parishioners speak of encounters in the woods, glimpses of something large and upright moving among the trees. They are afraid, though they will not speak openly of their fears. They believe naming such things gives them power. I have blessed the forest edge, placed crosses at the boundary between cleared land and wilderness. Whether this provides protection or merely comfort, I cannot say. But the encounters have lessened since. Vasquez photographed these documents, added them to his file. The historical pattern suggested something had been in these woods for a very long time. Whether it was still there, whether it was the same thing Sister Catherine had encountered, remained unknown. But the continuity was striking. Separated by 130 years, people were describing similar experiences, similar marks, similar fears. "Did Sister Catherine say anything about what she found in these documents?" Vasquez asked Sister Teresa. "She asked if I believed the accounts were literal or metaphorical," the archivist replied. "I told her that faith and folklore often intertwine, that early settlers might have attributed natural phenomena to supernatural causes due to lack of scientific understanding." She nodded, but seemed unconvinced. She said something I remember quite clearly. "Sometimes the simplest explanation is that people saw what they said they saw." Back at St. Hildegard's, Vasquez stood in the cemetery as the April afternoon faded to dusk. The forest was budding with early spring growth, the dense grey winter giving way to hints of green. He'd been working this case actively for over a month since the journal's discovery, and felt no closer to answers than when he'd started. Every piece of evidence led to more questions. Every explanation fell short. He thought about Sister Catherine's final journal entry, her statement that she wasn't afraid, that she was curious. She'd walked into this forest knowing something was waiting for her, believing she could make contact, understand, bridge the gap between human and, what? Unknown animal? Undiscovered species? Something else entirely? The rational part of his mind rejected the implications. There were no unknown large mammals in Pennsylvania. The state was too populated, too thoroughly explored, too scientifically documented. If something that size existed, it would have been found, studied, categorized. But the evidence suggested otherwise. The claw marks, the canopy movement, the historical accounts, Sister Catherine's careful observations, all of it pointed to the presence of something that shouldn't exist according to current biological knowledge. Dr. Ruiz had mentioned one more thing before leaving the site. She'd found something in one of the trees that puzzled her, a substance on several branches near the canopy platform. A secretion of some kind, dark and oily, unlike sap or any tree excretion she recognized. She'd collected samples for analysis, warned him not to expect quick results. But she'd said something that stayed with him. Whatever left that substance, it's not something we have in our databases. The chemical composition is anomalous. Another anomaly. Another piece that didn't fit. The case was becoming a collection of impossibilities that somehow, in the physical world, had occurred. As Vasquez prepared to leave, his phone rang. It was the forensic lab in Harrisburg, the technician who'd been analyzing various samples from the case. The man sounded hesitant, almost reluctant to share what he'd found. "Sergeant, we've been running tests on the organic material from Sister Catherine's journal cover, advanced DNA sequencing, really detailed analysis, and we found something unexpected." "Go on." "There are human DNA traces mixed with the animal proteins. Specifically, we found markers that match Sister Catherine's DNA profile. Her skin cells, oils, that makes sense. It's her journal. But there's also her DNA integrated with the unidentified animal proteins, almost like..." He paused, searching for words. "Like the substances had been in contact for an extended period, mixed together. The degradation patterns suggest exposure to the elements, to organic decomposition processes." "Sergeant, I don't want to speculate beyond the science, but these results are consistent with..." "With what?" Vasquez asked, though some part of him already knew. "With human remains. These proteins could be trace evidence of decomposed tissue, not from recent contact with the journal, but from when the journal itself was with the remains." The implication settled over Vasquez like a weight. The journal had been with Sister Catherine's body, wherever that body had ended up. The creature, the thing, the presence, whatever it was, had taken her, and the journal had accompanied her, become saturated with the chemical evidence of her death. Then somehow, impossibly, the journal had been placed inside the sealed wall of the confessional. "Is there any way to determine cause of death from these traces?" he asked. "No. The material is too degraded, too mixed. We can't even confirm death definitively, just that the DNA and proteins were exposed to decomposition processes." "I'm sorry, I can't be more specific." Vasquez thanked him and ended the call. He stood in the gathering darkness, looking at the forest that had taken Sister Catherine Brennan and kept her secrets. She'd gone willingly, her journal said. Curious, faithful, unafraid. What had she found in those woods? What had she learned in whatever time remained to her after crossing that threshold between civilization and wilderness? And why had the journal been returned, placed where it would eventually be found, as if something wanted the story told? If she went willingly to find answers, did she discover something that changed everything? Or did the forest simply take what it had been watching all along? The investigation entered a strange territory after that phone call, a place where evidence and explanation diverged so completely that Sergeant Daniel Vasquez found himself questioning not the facts themselves, but what framework could possibly contain them. He'd worked cases for 20 years, dealt with murders and disappearances, human cruelty and random tragedy. But this was different. This felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, where the rules he'd relied on no longer fully applied. He requested a final comprehensive search of the forest, this time with both ground teams and canopy specialists working in coordination. If Sister Catherine's remains were out there, if some physical trace of what had happened to her existed beyond scattered personal items and chemical signatures, he was determined to find it. The search ran for 5 days in mid-April, covering over 400 acres of dense woodland surrounding St. Hildegard's. They found nothing new, no bones, no clothing beyond what had already been recovered, no definitive evidence of Sister Catherine's final moments. The forest had absorbed her completely, leaving only fragments, a button, a piece of fabric, a rosary, like breadcrumbs that led nowhere, or everywhere. The absence of a body became its own kind of evidence, suggesting either expert concealment or circumstances so unusual that normal recovery methods simply didn't apply. Dr. Elena Ruiz provided her final report in late April. The canopy platform she'd discovered showed signs of repeated use over an extended period, possibly years. The broken branches displayed different ages of damage, some dating back 5 or 6 years, others more recent. Whatever had created that space had returned to it multiple times, suggesting territorial behavior or a preferred location. The mysterious secretion she'd collected from the branches had been analyzed by 3 separate laboratories, all reaching the same puzzling conclusion. The substance contained compounds similar to mammalian scent markers, but with molecular structures that didn't match any catalogued species. "It's like looking at a language you almost recognize," one biochemist explained to Vasquez. The grammar is familiar. These are definitely biological markers, definitely from a large mammal, but the specific words, the exact composition, doesn't correspond to anything in our reference databases. Either it's from a species we haven't properly documented, or... He trailed off, uncomfortable with the implications. Or what? Vasquez pressed. Or our databases are incomplete in ways we didn't realize. There may be genetic diversity in large mammals that we've failed to capture. Hybrid species, isolated populations with unusual mutations, evolutionary branches we've missed. Wildlife biology isn't as complete as we'd like to think, especially in remote areas. It was the closest thing to a satisfying answer Vasquez had received, an admission that the unknown still existed, even in a state as studied as Pennsylvania, even in the 21st century. The forest could still hold secrets. Something could still move through the trees unobserved, uncatalogued, existing in the gaps of human knowledge. He returned to the historical documents, searching for patterns. Over the course of several weeks, working with Sister Teresa at the Archdiocese archives, he traced references to unusual occurrences near St. Hildegard's across more than a century. The accounts came in waves, clusters of reports separated by years or decades of silence. The 1880s and 90s had numerous mentions, the German settlers clearly experiencing something that troubled them deeply. Then a gap until the 1930s, when Father Joseph Keller's records mentioned disturbances in the forest and parishioners reporting encounters with something large and unknown. Another gap until the 1960s, when the church underwent its major renovation, the same renovation that had sealed the wall space where the journal would later be found. The construction records from that period included a curious note from the foreman, a man named Robert Callahan, reporting that workers refused to enter the forest to cut timber after several experienced what they described as being watched by something that stayed just out of sight. The renovation had proceeded using purchased lumber instead. Most recently, before Sister Catherine's disappearance, there had been a brief mention in 2003. A visiting priest had written to the bishop describing unusual wildlife activity around the church and requesting permission to bless the forest boundary. Permission had been granted, though no follow-up reports existed. The pattern suggested cyclical activity, periods when whatever inhabited these woods became more active or perhaps more visible, followed by years of quiescence. Sister Catherine had arrived during what appeared to be another active period. She'd recognized something was present, documented its approach, and ultimately made the decision to engage with it directly. Vasquez interviewed more people, reaching beyond the immediate area. He spoke with wildlife officers across Pennsylvania, asking about unusual reports or sightings that hadn't been explained. Most had nothing useful to offer, but a few mentioned things that resonated with the evidence. A forest ranger in Cameron County described finding tree scratches similar to those at St. Hildegard's. A hunter in Potter County reported hearing vocalizations he couldn't identify, deep, resonant sounds that seemed too large for any known animal. A hiking guide in the Allegheny National Forest mentioned areas where her clients consistently felt uneasy, reporting sensations of being watched from the trees. None of it proved anything, but it suggested a wider pattern, a presence distributed across the forested regions of northern Pennsylvania. Not common enough to be obvious, but not so rare as to be singular. In early May, Vasquez received an unexpected call from a man named Thomas Brennan, Sister Catherine's younger brother, whom he'd spoken with briefly 3 years earlier. Thomas lived in Pittsburgh, worked as a software engineer, had maintained regular contact with his sister despite their different life paths. He'd been following the renewed investigation in the news and wanted to meet. They sat in a coffee shop in Pittsburgh on a grey Saturday afternoon, Thomas nervous but determined to share something he'd kept private. "Catherine sent me a letter about 2 weeks before she disappeared," Thomas said, his hands wrapped around his cup. "Not an email or text, an actual handwritten letter. That's how I knew it was important. She only did that when she needed to say something significant." He pulled out an envelope, worn from handling, and extracted 2 pages of Catherine's neat handwriting. Vasquez read with growing attention. The letter described her experiences at St. Hildegard's in more personal terms than the journal entries, revealing emotional dimensions she'd kept private elsewhere. She wrote about feeling called to understand something beyond normal experience, about believing that faith meant engaging with mystery rather than hiding from it. She described the presence in the forest not as threatening, but as profoundly other, intelligent, ancient, existing outside the categories humans use to organize the world. The final paragraph made Vasquez's breath catch. "If something happens to me, Thomas, know that I chose it." Not out of despair or recklessness, but out of a deep conviction that some encounters are worth the risk. We spend our lives building walls between ourselves and the unknown, calling it safety, calling it rationality. But what if the unknown isn't dangerous? Just different? What if the things we fear are simply things we haven't learned to understand? I believe God created a world far stranger and more wonderful than we acknowledge. I want to see it, even if only briefly. I want to stand in the presence of mystery and say, I wasn't afraid. Please don't be angry with me, and please don't let them make me sound crazy. I'm not. I'm just curious about the edges of creation. Thomas looked at Vasquez with red-rimmed eyes. She knew she might not come back. She went anyway. Does that help your investigation? It confirms what her journal suggested, Vasquez said carefully, that she made a conscious choice. That reduces the likelihood of foul play, at least from a human source. But not from whatever was in those woods. No, not from that. Thomas folded the letter carefully, returned it to its envelope. Do you think she's dead, Sergeant? Honestly? Vasquez considered his words carefully. The forensic evidence suggests she likely didn't survive the encounter, but I can't tell you definitively what happened or where her remains might be. I'm sorry. But you think something took her? Something not normal. I think something exists in that forest that we don't fully understand. Whether it took her or she went with it willingly, I can't say for certain. The evidence supports both interpretations. They sat in silence for a moment, the coffee shop noise washing around them. Finally, Thomas said, "She was always braver than me, always willing to walk toward things I'd run from. I guess I have to trust that she knew what she was doing, that whatever she found was what she was looking for." Vasquez left Pittsburgh with a copy of the letter and a deeper understanding of Sister Catherine as a person. She hadn't been a victim, not in the traditional sense. She'd been an explorer, someone who'd seen a boundary and chosen to cross it, accepting the consequences. That didn't make her loss less tragic, but it changed the nature of the tragedy. This wasn't a story of random violence or accident. This was a story about choice, about curiosity, about the human desire to touch the edges of the unknown. The question that remained was why the journal had been returned. Vasquez obsessed over this detail. If Sister Catherine had died in the forest, her journal with her, why would it appear 3 years later inside a sealed church wall? The most rational explanation was human involvement. Someone had found her remains, recovered the journal, and placed it in the confessional for reasons unknown. But the wall had been sealed for decades. The construction workers had confirmed the nails were original, undisturbed. The dust patterns were consistent with a space untouched since the 1960s. Unless the journal had been placed there from inside the wall cavity itself. But there was no access from inside, no way to reach that space, except by removing the paneling from the sanctuary side. He returned to St. Hildegard's one evening in late May, walking through the empty church with Father Kowalski, who'd agreed to meet him there. They stood in the confessional, now partially disassembled from the renovation work, the wall cavity visible. "Is there any way," Vasquez asked, "any architectural quirk or hidden access, that someone could have reached this space from another direction? From the attic or from outside the building, or through some passage we're not aware of?" Father Kowalski studied the structure carefully. "I've been coming to this church for 15 years, and I've never seen or heard of any hidden passages. The building is simple, stone walls, wooden interior, a small attic that's easily accessed by ladder. The confessional was built as part of the original 1887 construction, modified in the 60s. There's no secret architecture here, Sergeant, just an old church." Vasquez ran his hand along the exposed wall cavity, feeling the rough wood and accumulated dust. The journal had been right here, wedged deep, marked with those claw gouges, as if something had pushed it through from the other side. But there was no other side, just solid stone wall. "What if," he said slowly, thinking aloud, "what if it wasn't placed here from our side at all? What if something pushed it through the wall itself?" Father Kowalski looked at him with concern. "Sergeant, that's not physically possible." I know, but nothing about this case has been physically possible by normal standards. They stood in silence, the weight of unsolved mystery heavy in the sacred space. Finally, Father Kowalski said, "In Scripture there are stories of angels passing through walls, of divine beings moving through physical barriers as if they were immaterial. We call them miracles because they violate natural law. But perhaps the natural laws we know are incomplete. Perhaps there are aspects of physical reality we simply haven't discovered yet." It was as close to an explanation as Vasquez was likely to get. The journal had appeared in an impossible location through impossible means, carrying evidence of Sister Catherine's fate and her final intentions. Whether that was miracle, mystery, or some unknown physical phenomenon, he couldn't say. The case remained officially open, but the active investigation wound down by June. Vasquez compiled his final reports, organized the evidence, ensured everything was properly documented and preserved. He'd done everything possible with the resources and knowledge available. Sister Catherine Brennan had disappeared on November 18, 2020. 3 years later, her journal had been discovered in a church wall. The evidence suggested she'd been carried into the forest canopy, that she'd died there, that something unknown had been involved. Her remains had not been recovered. That was the official conclusion. Missing person, presumed deceased, cause and circumstances undetermined. But Vasquez's personal conclusion was more complex. He believed Sister Catherine had encountered something genuinely unknown, something that existed in the gaps between documented species and understood biology. He believed she'd made contact with this presence deliberately, out of curiosity and faith. He believed she'd died as a result, though whether through violence, accident, or some other cause remained unknowable. And he believed, though he could never prove it, that something had returned her journal as a form of communication, a way of completing her story, of allowing her voice to survive even if her body had not. Why place it in the confessional? Why choose that specific location? Perhaps because it was a sacred space, a place of confession and revelation. Perhaps because whatever had taken Sister Catherine understood, in its own alien way, that humans would eventually find it there. Perhaps it was simply the closest interior space to the forest edge, and something had pushed the journal through stone and wood, using means humans didn't yet comprehend. On a warm evening in late June, Vasquez made one final visit to St. Hildegard's. The renovation was complete, the confessional restored and beautiful, the wall cavity sealed again behind fresh paneling. The church felt peaceful, the long shadows of afternoon sunlight streaming through the old windows. He walked through the cemetery to the forest edge, standing where Sister Catherine's footprints had ended 3.5 years earlier. The forest was lush with summer growth now, the understory thick with ferns and saplings, the canopy fully leafed and dense. Somewhere in that green expanse, Sister Catherine Brennan rested. Somewhere in those trees, perhaps, something ancient and unknown still moved, still watched, still existed at the boundary of human understanding. He thought about her final journal entry, her statement that she wasn't afraid, that she was choosing to go. He thought about Thomas's letter, her conviction that mystery was worth engaging rather than avoiding. He thought about all the people across more than a century who'd glimpsed something in these woods, who'd felt that presence, who'd chosen either to dismiss it or acknowledge it. "I hope you found what you were looking for," he said quietly to the forest. "I hope it was worth it." The forest offered no answer, just the evening sounds of birds and wind and rustling leaves. But as Vasquez turned to walk back to his vehicle, something caught his eye in the growing shadows. Movement, perhaps, or just the play of light through branches. Something tall and dark and still just beyond the tree line, there for a moment and then gone. He stopped, stared, waited. Nothing, just forest. But he felt it, that weight of attention Sister Catherine had described, that sense of being observed by something intelligent and patient. It wasn't threatening. It was just aware, acknowledging him as he acknowledged it. Vasquez stood there for a long moment, investigator and mystery regarding each other across the boundary between known and unknown. Then he nodded slightly, a gesture of respect or farewell, and walked back to his car. The case would remain in the files, unsolved in official terms but understood in deeper ways. Sister Catherine Brennan had crossed a threshold few people even perceived existed. She'd stood in the presence of something extraordinary and left a record so others would know. Her journal, impossibly placed, impossibly preserved, was her final gift. Proof that the world held more than humanity had catalogued, that mystery still lived at the edges of civilization, that wonder and terror still walked in the ancient forests. Whether you called it animal, entity, or something beyond category entirely, it had been there. Perhaps still was. And somewhere in those endless trees, in a place humans would never find, Sister Catherine's story had reached its conclusion. A conclusion she'd chosen, driven by faith and curiosity and the bravest kind of courage. The courage to walk toward the unknown and say, "I'm not afraid to see." Years later, when asked about the case, Sergeant Vasquez would always say the same thing. "We found evidence. We couldn't find answers. Sometimes that's the most honest conclusion possible." And late at night, when he pulled out the case file and looked through the photographs and reports, he'd remember that moment at the forest edge, that sense of mutual recognition between himself and something other, and he'd wonder if Sister Catherine, in her final moments, had felt fear or wonder. He hoped it was wonder. He hoped she'd seen something beautiful in the darkness, something that made her choice worthwhile. The forest keeps its secrets. But sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear them whispered in the wind through the trees, carried on the fog that rolls through Pennsylvania valleys, preserved in journals found in impossible places. Sister Catherine Brennan walked into mystery on a November evening. She never walked back out, but her voice survived, asking future generations the same question she'd asked herself. What if the edges of the world aren't boundaries to fear, but invitations to understand something greater than ourselves? The case of Sister Catherine Brennan remains officially unsolved. St. Hildegard's Church still stands on Shepherd's Mill Road, surrounded by forest, holding its memories and mysteries. The journal is preserved in the Pennsylvania State Police Evidence Archives. And sometimes on quiet evenings, visitors to the old cemetery report feeling watched from the tree line, not threatened, but observed, as if something ancient and patient is still there, still waiting, still holding secrets in the spaces between the known and unknown world.